So we've covered ecology. Well, not all of ecology, but all that we've got time for. And I want to finish this class by looking at kind of bringing things back together to a human perspective. You know, we've been talking about all of this biological diversity, how it got here, how it reproduces, how it ultimately works down on the molecular level when we've talked about DNA and proteins and metabolism and things like that. And we've kind of come down off that mountain, looking at how it all fits together into the natural world. And I want to finish by looking at the relationship between the natural world and humanity. You hear a lot these days about the need to conserve the environment, protect endangered species, prepare for major ecological change in the wake of global climate change, and things like that. And maybe some of you folks are philosophically perfectly fine with trying to save nature or defend the environment, protect endangered species, and so on. Some of you may be kind of like me, you know, kind of a aging, you know, old school hippie punk who believes that it's important to conserve these things, you know, endangered species or endangered ecosystems, because they're rare, they're beautiful, and they have intrinsic value of their own, that they're worth conserving simply because they are what they are. Having said that, this particular lecture, I always tend to pitch towards the business majors, the people who are likeliest to believe, okay, yes, endangered species are rare and beautiful and cool, but sometimes we just have to bulldoze them down because jobs, because it's important to have jobs and be prosperous and you know, boost our long-term stock options and things like that. So I want to end this class by looking a little bit as to what we really do mean by value, and what all of this thing we've been talking about from the beginning, all of this nature, all of this nearly 10 million living species really means for humanity. So just for fun, I'm going to give you something to think about. This is a species, genus Aeluropoda, species Melanoleuca, otherwise known as the giant panda. And I'm guessing that most people right now are maybe inwardly saying, "Aw," because pandas are adorable. They are cute and they have those beautiful faces with the big black spots around their eyes. And they sit there eating tender bamboo shoots, and they're the emblem of one of our sororities. I can't remember if it's Alpha Sig Tau, but it's one of them. And, you know, kids go to sleep every night cuddling stuffed versions of them, and they're just absolutely adorable. And if you heard that the panda was endangered, no doubt you would want to take certain steps or hope that certain steps might be taken to make sure that the panda does not go extinct, because, right, it's a, you know, it's the emblem of the World Wildlife Federation because it's cute and it's fluffy and it's got eyes. Here is a slimy, hideous, disgusting sea slug named Dolabella auricularia. I am pretty sure that very few children go to bed cuddling stuffed sea slugs in the genus Dolabella. I mean, my sister would have absolutely loved one of these, but my sister's always been kind of a weirdo. I'm pretty sure that nobody is going, "Aw," when you look at this, because it looks like something that somebody excreted. It doesn't have much of a face. It's not photogenic. I mean, it's a great big slimy slug. And I'm guessing that if I asked everybody, which species would you rather save? Which one, if I told you both of these were in danger of going extinct and we could only save one of them, I'm betting that most people would pick the panda over the sea slug. Just a guess here, but I'm guessing that most of you feel more warm, fuzzy feelings towards the panda rather than the slimy, hideous, and disgusting sea slug. Just a guess here. Now, here's the thing. Dolabella auricularia is soft and squishy and has no bones and no armor and lives in an ocean world where everybody's got lots of teeth. Dolabella would be a nice tasty snack if it wasn't for the fact that it's poisonous. A lot of soft, squishy sea critters are very toxic if you actually try to eat them. Now, here's the thing. An early influential scientist back in the Renaissance time, back in the 1500s, a man named Paracelsus once said, "The dose makes the poison." In other words, the only difference between a drug and a poison is the dose. A lot of life-saving drugs will kill you if you overdose on them. Heck, aspirin and Tylenol will kill you if you overdose on them and kill you in nasty ways. And the flip side is true, that a lot of poisons turn out to have medical use as drugs if you learn how to use them and how to apply them. And beginning in the 1980s, some compounds were found called dolastatins that block mitosis. They mess with the spindle fibers, and hopefully you remember what mitosis and spindle fibers are, because it's going to be on the final. Hint, hint, hint. Now, here's the thing. You might wonder why blocking mitosis is a good idea. Bear in mind that cancer is mitosis out of control. That's as good a definition of cancer as you'll get. When a population of cells begins dividing and can't stop and can't slow down, you get this huge population of abnormal cells that begin to draw down the body's nutrition and resources. That's cancer. So anything that blocks cell division is potentially useful as an anti-cancer drug. There's a modified version of one of these dolastatins. And of course, they give it these weird names. It's called brentuximab vedotin. The trade name is Adcetris. And it's currently being used to treat Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a rather nasty type of cancer. It's being used to treat certain other types of lymphoma, including the type that my wife's mother has been battling for the past 5 years or so. And that's not the only dolastatin out there. There's a whole family of dolastatins found in Dolabella. Some of them are being investigated right now, and they might turn out to be effective against other types of cancer, or maybe have better side effects, or something like that. We don't really know where this is going to go. Now I'll bet you're feeling just a little bit kinder towards this hideous and disgusting sea slug, because there's a product in there that is saving or prolonging lives. And there's about 4,000 other species of sea slug that we know about. I wouldn't be surprised if there's 5 times that many that we don't know about. And it makes you wonder what else we might find. There's a lot of toxic sea slugs, and more often than you'd realize, toxins turn out to be also medicines. Somebody ought to look. And we have this very long history of extracting medicines from plants. It goes back to, chimpanzees and orangutans have been observed eating plants, not because they're tasty, but because they are medicinal. It's very likely, the earliest human populations did this. There's still people today that use herbs in medicine, and some of those work. But here's a more recent case. This gentleman here, and for those of you concerned about this, the first African-American scientist I've had the chance to mention. When we've talked about scientists of the past, many of them lived in a time when Africans were not encouraged to go into science. But certainly in areas where they have gotten supports, they have made just as good contributions as anybody can. There's been some great African-American scientists and scientists of every group. Science is the kind of thing that anybody can do. And Percy Julian in the 1950s worked out ways to extract compounds from plants like soybeans, and also, like the plant on the left, this very weird thing with a giant scaly root called Dioscorea barbata, aka Mexican yam. And he worked out ways to convert those into steroid hormones. His work made birth control possible. If you're not down with that, his work also made things like cortisone possible. If you've ever gotten an injection of cortisone, maybe if you sprain a joint or something like that, if you've ever gotten a steroid shot to take down inflammation and swelling, that's ultimately made possible because of Percy Julian and his colleagues. So there. That's a soil fungus called Tolipocladium. You can see the hyphae. Remember hyphae? We talked about that in lecture. It's going to be on the final. There's a hypha, that long filament. And various little spores are budding off of the hypha. If you remember spores, that's a common soil fungus. And some of it was isolated from a soil sample in Norway in 1969. And it just so happens to produce a drug called cyclosporine. Cyclosporine suppresses the body's immune system. Now, you might think we wouldn't want to do that, but bear in mind that when you transplant an organ into somebody else's body, that person's immune system will attack the organ unless you do something to dial back that person's immune system. So if you ever get an organ transplant, you have to take immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of your life. Cyclosporine was one of the first drugs found that would do that. And cyclosporine turned organ transplants from crazy science fiction stuff into an almost routine procedure. It made it a practical treatment for many people, rather than something that was usually just done as kind of an act of desperation. So there's lots of people today that are alive and living more or less normally thanks to cyclosporine. And it comes from a soil fungus. One of the Nobel Prize winners in medicine, I need to update this slide because this is 2015. A Chinese researcher whose name is Tu Youyou developed a drug from a plant called sweet wormwood, Artemisia annua, shown on the right. It's called artemisinin, and it has been saving lives for decades from a disease called malaria caused by a protist. And you personally may not worry that much about malaria because it's been almost wiped out in the United States. Not entirely, but I think Arkansas gets maybe 10 cases a year. So it's very rare here. Globally, it's one of the big killers. About 20 years ago, the statistic was that nearly 1 million people globally died of malaria every year, most of them children under 5. Malaria infects something like 200 million people a year. Most of them don't die, but it causes periodic bouts of severe pain, fever, and chills and weakness that certainly limit your ability to work or provide for kids or really do anything other than lie in bed. And part of the reason that the global death toll's been cut in half is the discovery of drugs like artemisinin. The other winners of the Nobel Prize that year, William C. Campbell and Satoshi Omura, developed a whole family of anti-parasite drugs from a bacterium called Streptomyces avermitilis. This is a weird bacterium that grows in filaments. It thinks it's a fungus, but it isn't really. It is a prokaryote, but that's what it looks like over there on the right. One of the drugs that was derived from Streptomyces avermitilis is called ivermectin. Ivermectin has been shown in very well-designed clinical trials not to be effective against COVID, but it is very effective against parasites. It's used in veterinary medicine and agriculture quite a lot. It does have some applications in human medicine. It's effective against human diseases, such as one thing called onchocerciasis, AKA African river blindness. Not a big problem here, but one of the leading causes of blindness in parts of Africa. One of the most useful drugs that's out there, except it doesn't really help against bleep and bleep, bleep, blankety, blankety COVID. But it works on other things. And they won the Nobel Prize for it back in 2015. And it comes from a soil bacterium. Something on the order of 25% of all prescription drugs are either isolated from plants and animals, or they were at least discovered in plants and animals, even if we now make them artificially. Aspirin was originally isolated from the bark of willow trees. Now, aspirin these days is made synthetically, but it was first discovered in this natural source that people had been using for centuries. Sudafed is an artificial version of a compound that was isolated first from a plant called joint fir, genus Ephedra. So everything from over-the-counter headache remedies to life-saving chemotherapy drugs have been isolated from the living world, and we keep finding them more and more. Okay, maybe you're not interested in drugs. Well, this is a product that's come on the market in the past 20 years or so. That's a South American shrub called Stevia rebaudiana. You can actually grow it around here. I've seen it sold in garden stores. The common name is sweet leaf because extracts of its leaves are 300 times sweeter than sugar, and they haven't got any calories. You can actually buy stevia extracts in supermarkets under brand names like Truvia and Purevia. So that's useful, a no-calorie sweetener from a natural source. This plant on the left is called Ilex guayusa. It's found in the Amazon. Its leaves happen to contain caffeine, and you can brew extracts of these leaves into a rather nice tea. There's a company called Runa that makes energy drinks out of the leaves of guayusa. I've had it before. It's actually pretty good. The base taste is kind of in between tea and coffee. And then Runa adds fruit extracts and things like that. And the Runa company was founded in 2009. They make energy drinks from guayusa. The guayusa is harvested by small farmers in Ecuador. They pick leaves. They don't have to kill the plants to do it. They just pick leaves and allow the plant to keep growing, so the plant is not destroyed. 20,000 Ecuadorian small farmers make some money by harvesting guayusa leaves and selling them to Runa. And last I heard, Runa was employing about 300, 400 people in the United States. So it's jobs in both countries. It's doing quite well. I haven't seen it sold full time in Arkansas yet, but at least a couple of years ago, my local Kroger had it for a while. I think they ordered some as a test run to see how well it did. And I tried some, and personally, I like it. It's a perfectly good value added product. And it comes from one of these rainforest plants. Parthenium argentatum, the guayule plant, grows in harsh desert, doesn't need much water, doesn't need fertilizer or herbicide. You can grow it in areas where you can't grow anything else. And you can harvest it to produce a form of rubber that is just like latex rubber, but doesn't cause allergies. Somebody ought to make a buck on that. Here's a fungus for you. You're looking at an odd type of spore called conidiospores that this particular type of fungus produces. In 2011, it was discovered that this fungus, Pestalodiopsis microspori, can break down the plastic polyurethane. There's other fungi and bacteria that have been found that can actually break down plastic. And given that there's so much plastic trash in the world, we bury most of it, we recycle some, but not all plastic is recyclable, and we can't keep recycling it indefinitely. Given that most plastic just ends up in landfills, fungi like Pestalodiopsis may provide a solution to the plastic waste problem. It's even been suggested it might be possible to engineer fungi to break down plastics and convert them to edible protein or something like that. It's not quite here yet, but it might be one of the things that gets us out of one of the ecological messes that we're in. I'll give you another one, Camelina sativa, aka false flax, shown on the right. Like guayule, it grows in rotten soil, and so it doesn't compete with food crops. The seeds are oil rich, and beginning in 2010, the US Air Force started testing a 50-50 blend of standard aviation fuel mixed with camelina, and it works perfectly well. In fact, in September 2011, they actually flew the Blue Angels, right? The Air Force's acrobatic demonstration team on this blend of aviation fuel with camelina oil, and it worked just fine. One of the things that the current war in Ukraine ought to remind you of is that, a fair amount of petroleum is controlled by countries that aren't always friendly. The US was not buying a great deal of Russian petroleum. I think it was about 2%. But Europe, for example, was buying a lot of Russian petroleum, and that gives Russia economic leverage in Europe. And you can see how that's been playing out in the news. Wouldn't it be awfully nice if we could fly our airplanes using, in part, some sort of fuel that can be grown anywhere and isn't dependent on the goodwill of countries that we may not really want to deal with that much? There's a lot to be said for trying to wean ourselves off of petroleum. And it would be nice if we didn't have to use the stuff at all because of its contribution to global climate change. Failing that, there's some very good, both liberal and conservative reasons for trying to use renewable fuels whenever we can. And this is one that might end up being extremely useful. And it comes from a little weedy plant that you probably never realize. That's another organism that's being looked at as a source of biodiesel. This is a microscopic green alga called Scenedesmus. Typical colonies consist of exactly 4 cells. They can grow quite abundantly in fresh water. I've grown them in my own lab. And if you give them the right mix of nutrients, up to 60% of a Scenedesmus is droplets of lipids, droplets of oil. And it is possible to process this into diesel fuel. It's possible that one day we're all going to be running our dualies and rolling coal. Well, I hope not rolling coal, burning diesel fuel that's derived from something like Scenedesmus. There's a lot of projects underway to try to see how we might do this. And it might help with the problems that we are going to be facing with increasing intensity. One last one. This is kind of a critter that scares people if they're not used to it. It's the Atlantic horseshoe crab, common name Limulus polyphemus. You might really not feel warm fuzzies towards critters that have this many legs and no obvious face and claws at the end of their feet so they can pinch you. People tend not to feel real cuddly towards horseshoe crabs. But here's the thing, horseshoe crab blood is very sensitive to bacterial endotoxins. And you might remember those from about week 2 or 3. Endotoxins are parts of bacterial cells that have a toxic effect. Even tiny little traces of bacteria make horseshoe crab blood clot very rapidly. What's so great about that? Okay, so it's a weird looking, scary crab with entirely too many legs, and its blood clots in the presence of bacteria. Horseshoe crab blood is the most sensitive test that we have for bacterial contamination. Here's horseshoe crab blood being harvested. And by the way, horseshoe crab blood is this kind of sky blue color. They've got a different pigment in their blood from us. So their blood is actually a rather pretty baby blue. The crabs do survive this and they're returned to the water at the end. And horseshoe crab blood is used to test for bacterial contamination of anything that's injected into a body. If you've ever had an antibiotic shot or a vaccine or saline in an IV, anything that's injected, every batch of injectables, vaccine or saline or whatever it is, has to be tested for bacterial contamination, and the test they use involves horseshoe crab blood. That's how we ensure the safety of everything that a healthcare professional might inject into a person. You know, that ensured your safety the last injection that you got, horseshoe crab blood. So there's the bottom line. Hundreds of thousands of chemicals are known from animals and plants, and we discover hundreds more every year. Not every last one of them turns out to be immediately useful, but an awful lot of them have useful properties as drugs. Or else some of them aren't useful themselves, but they led to the discovery of new drugs. You might remember that a few lectures back, I talked about drugs that were effective at shutting down DNA replication because they looked like nucleotides but weren't. They were phony nucleotides. And if you fed them to, let's say, a cancer cell or a cell infected by viruses, the cell would try to use the phony nucleotides in replicating its DNA or transcribing its RNA, and it wouldn't be able to do it because those phony nucleotides were essentially jamming up the works. Those drugs all come from a project in the 1960s that discovered compounds that had this effect in sea sponges. Now, the actual sea sponge compounds turned out not to be useful, but the principle of how they work led to everything from acyclovir to treat for herpes, to AZT, an effective drug against HIV infection, to, what are they calling it? Molnupiravir, which was recently approved as a drug to fight COVID. So even though the drugs that were isolated from sea sponges turned out not to be useful, they led to the discovery of some very useful drugs in the long run. Even many drugs that are now artificially made were first discovered in plants and animals. And there's that stat, 1/4 of all prescriptions written in the United States are for drugs that either are plant products or were derived from plant products. Everything from over-the-counter remedies to life-saving anti-cancer and antiviral drugs all comes ultimately from nature. We'd never have discovered them if we didn't go looking among the world of biological diversity. And more potential drugs are constantly being discovered and refined and tested. This is an ongoing process. There's many other products that are useful as sources of fuel, new sources of food, dyes, new consumer products like like BIOL rubber and things like that. What was I reading just recently? One of the beauty fads of at least a couple of years ago was in Korea. You can go to spas where you get snail slime on your face as a beauty treatment. I don't know if it works, but somebody ought to look into that. It is possible that, the next great product that you'll use to stave off wrinkles is going to be something that was isolated from Korean snails. Who knows? Crazier things have happened. And organisms provide more indirect services as well. You're looking at a flock of bats flying out at dusk, and they're going to spend all night flying around eating insects. Somebody worked out that a single Tadarida brasilensis, the common short-tailed bat that we have around here, one single bat can eat one insect, one mosquito or one bug every 10 seconds all night long. Multiply that by the fact that some bat colonies consist of as many as 2 million bats. The bat colony under the Centennial Avenue Bridge in Austin, Texas, is about 2 million bats. So do the math, one insect every 10 seconds all night long by as many as 2 million bats. It's been estimated that insect-eating bats save the US agricultural industry at least $3 billion a year. And I've seen some estimates as high as 53 billion. Think of all the mosquitoes that don't bite you because they get eaten by bats, or all of the moths that don't lay eggs on crop plants and the crop plants get devoured by the caterpillars because the bats eat them. There's a very strong and definite benefit to US agriculture. Think of all the crops that aren't ruined or all the pesticides that don't have to be sprayed because of bats. These are beehives getting trucked into an apple orchard. And you might recall that pollen contains plant sperm. There's certainly a lot of pollen around at this time of year in the spring, and each pollen grain contains sperm cells of plants. And since plants can't move around and, walk up and, ask for each other's phone numbers or things like that, they depend on other ways to get pollen from one plant to another. And many species of flowering plant depend on bees or moths or bats or sometimes flies or other insects to transfer pollen from one flower to another. Crop pollination adds at least $15 billion to the value of US agriculture. These honeybees are getting trucked into an apple orchard. They'll sit there for a few weeks and the bees will fly around, eat pollen and drink nectar from the apple flowers. And by doing that, transfer pollen from one apple flower to the next, which is what will make the apple flower eventually yield a fruit. No pollinators, no apples. And honeybees are brought in to do pollination for, let me think, apples, almonds, all your citrus, melons, all of your berries, blueberry, blackberry, raspberry, etc., cucumbers, squash and zucchini and things like that. Many of your herbs, and also clover and alfalfa, which you don't eat, but animals do. So, the cows and especially cows, I guess, that you eat may have been fed on clover and alfalfa hay, and those depend on honeybees. In fact, about 30% of the US food supply depends on pollinators, on honeybees, and to a lesser extent on moths and bats and bumblebees and things like that. And finally, even when we don't directly harvest a product or a service from a living thing, we can harvest ideas from them. A very simple example would be sonar, the ability to, navigate by sending out pulses of sound and getting a picture of your surroundings on the basis of the reflection. It's what submarines use to navigate and to find each other. That was based on the echolocation that bats and whales can do. They also send out pulses of sound and use the reflection to track their surroundings. This is one that was actually worked out by one of my graduate student instructors when I was a young woodchuck, when I was about your age. That's the foot of a gecko. And geckos can climb almost any surface and hang on to almost any surface. I think we are starting to get introduced geckos in Arkansas. I don't know how many of you have seen them, but they can walk right across the ceiling. They can go straight up a glass window and hang on. They're able to do it because that foot has millions and millions of tiny bristles. In fact, that picture on the left is what those tiny bristles look like, magnified very highly. And one of the guys who did this was my old graduate student instructor, a guy named Keller Autumn. And he and colleagues came up with a way to produce an artificial material that worked like gecko feet. It's called gec skin. I'm not sure how widely available it is, but it's been produced. And you can take a piece of gec skin the size of an index card, you can stick it to a smooth glass surface, you can hang a weight of up to 700 pounds on it securely, and then you can peel it off easily and leave nothing behind. So a couple of squares of gec skin and you could hang up your flat screen TV right there on the wall, and then peel it off when you move and not have to worry about your landlord giving you crap for leaving stuff on the walls. There's a lot of potential uses for this, and the idea ultimately came from studying lizard feet. Some people might say, why the heck would you bother with studying lizard feet? Why can't you get a degree in something that's got some use? Well, guess what? Sometimes studying things like lizard feet actually does have some use. Designs like this are called biomimetics, by the way. Imitation of life, biomimetics. Last concept I want to introduce. There's species in an ecosystem whose presence has a very large effect on overall species diversity. A keystone species may or may not be an apex predator. It doesn't have to be. It may not be a predator at all. But what happens is that losing a keystone species has a ripple effect on the ecosystem. If you lose the keystone species, the entire ecosystem is fundamentally altered. So even if you don't directly benefit from a keystone species, it may be critical to conserve them in the interest of conserving an entire ecosystem, not just a small part of it. And I'll tell you what, I was going to keep going, but it actually makes sense to end things here. So I'm going to pick up with keystone species next time. And I just want to leave you with the thought that conserving nature, conserving species of animal and plant may not seem like it's good business, but very, 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 very often it is. There are ways that we can use the species of animals and plants and everything that we find around us that don't involve harvesting them, don't involve wiping them out, but instead bring great value to our lives. There isn't necessarily a conflict between human welfare and the welfare of the natural world. More often than people sometimes realize, you can in fact do both. You can benefit humanity by studying and conserving living species. So business majors, take note. Some of the things that we've covered, maybe you're not that interested in biology, but some of the things that we've covered have led directly towards people benefiting humanity and making a great deal of money. So maybe there is something in this class that you've learned that might ultimately make you the next, great tycoon. Who knows? Things like that have already happened. You can benefit human economies and also at the same time conserve wild species. In fact, sometimes the best way to benefit humanity is by conserving the wild and the ecosystems that fill it. So I will leave you to ponder that.